New Orleans, a city known for its rich culture, vibrant music, and the indomitable spirit of its people, has also been the site of profound tragedy. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the Crescent City was plunged into chaos.
When Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, entire neighborhoods vanished under 20 feet of water.
Floodwaters surged, neighborhoods were devastated, and the government response was slow and woefully inadequate. Amid this turmoil, a darker story unfolded.
People were shot and killed by the New Orleans Police Department.
11 civilians were shot by New Orleans police officers.
One of police misconduct, cover-ups, and a judicial reckoning that would shake the city to its core. The year was 2005. Hurricane Katrina had just ravaged New Orleans, leaving destruction and heartbreak in its wake. The city's infrastructure was crippled, law enforcement was overwhelmed, and the social fabric of the community was fraying. In the midst of this chaos, 7 officers from the New Orleans Police Department were dispatched to the Danziger Bridge, responding to reports of gunfire. What happened next would go down in history as one of the most egregious examples of police brutality and corruption. Without warning, the officers opened fire on a group of unarmed civilians, people who were simply trying to survive the chaos of the flood. The result was tragic. 2 innocent people lost their lives, and 4 others were seriously injured. But the horror didn't end there. The officers, realizing the gravity of what they had done, quickly concocted a cover story. They claimed that they had been fired upon and were merely defending themselves. They planted a gun, falsified reports, and colluded to ensure that their version of events would be the official narrative. For a time, it seemed like they might get away with it. In the chaotic environment of post-Katrina New Orleans, where trust in the authorities was already at an all-time low, the officer's story was initially accepted. The public, still reeling from the devastation of the hurricane, had little reason to doubt the word of law enforcement. But the truth, as it so often does, refused to stay buried. The victims were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. James Brissett, just 17 years old, was looking for shelter with his family when he was gunned down. Ronald Madison, a 40-year-old man with developmental disabilities, was simply trying to cross the bridge to safety when he was shot in the back. Their families were left shattered, not only by the loss, but by the lies that followed. But this wasn't the end of the story. As details slowly began to emerge, cracks started to appear in the officers' accounts. Witnesses came forward, brave enough to challenge the official story. Civil rights attorneys, determined to seek justice for the victims, pushed for a thorough investigation. What they uncovered was a web of deceit, corruption, and a gross miscarriage of justice. The case was taken up by federal investigators who were determined to get to the bottom of what really happened on the Danziger Bridge. They painstakingly gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and slowly unraveled the conspiracy. It became clear that the officers had not only committed murder, but had also engaged in a systematic cover-up to hide their crimes. And this is where our story today truly begins, in the courtroom of U.S. District Judge Kurt Engelhardt. As the trial commenced, the nation watched, waiting to see if justice would finally be served. Would these corrupt officers be held accountable? Would the truth finally come to light? And would the families of James Brissett and Ronald Madison see justice for their loved ones? Judge Engelhardt knew the weight of the responsibility before him. This was not just a trial about what happened on a bridge. It was a trial about the very soul of a city, about the integrity of its police force, and about the pursuit of justice in a system that too often fails the most vulnerable. So how did Judge Engelhardt handle the case? What was the outcome for the officers involved? And what legacy did the Danziger Bridge case leave behind? Stay with us as we delve into the details of how one judge took on corruption in the New Orleans Police Department, and in doing so, sent a powerful message that echoed far beyond the walls of his courtroom. Background on the NOPD and Hurricane Katrina. Before the storm hit, New Orleans was a city full of life, known for its vibrant culture, music, and history. But beneath the surface, there was a darker side, a police department struggling with corruption and misconduct. The NOPD had a troubled past, marred by allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and in some cases, outright criminal behavior by officers. The NOPD was no stranger to controversy. Over the years, there had been multiple investigations into the department's practices, leading to several high-profile cases of police officers being indicted for various crimes. Despite efforts to clean up the force, the culture of corruption seemed deeply ingrained. And then came Hurricane Katrina. On August 29, 2005, the storm made landfall, and the levees protecting the city failed, leading to catastrophic flooding. New Orleans was plunged into chaos. The government response was slow, and the city descended into a state of lawlessness. Looting, violence, and desperation became the norm as residents struggled to survive. The NOPD, already weakened by years of internal issues, was overwhelmed. Officers were stretched thin and some abandoned their posts. Those who remained faced an impossible task, trying to maintain order in a city that was falling apart. But in the midst of this chaos, some officers took advantage of the situation in the worst possible ways. The Danziger Bridge Incident. On the morning of September 4, 2005, the city was still reeling from the aftermath of Katrina. The Danziger Bridge, which connects the Gentilly neighborhood to eastern New Orleans, had become a critical crossing point for residents and rescue workers alike. But for a group of civilians trying to make their way across that day, it would become a deadly trap. A group of 6 civilians, including 17-year-old James Brissett and 40-year-old Ronald Madison, were attempting to cross the bridge. They had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. Without warning, a group of NOPD officers arrived on the scene, responding to a report of gunfire in the area. The officers, heavily armed and on edge, opened fire on the civilians. James Brissett was killed almost instantly, his body riddled with bullets. Ronald Madison, who was mentally disabled, was shot in the back as he tried to flee. The other 4 civilians were severely wounded, but they managed to survive the initial assault. What happened next was even more shocking. Instead of calling for medical help, the officers began to concoct a story to justify their actions. They claimed that they had been under attack and that the civilians had fired on them first. To support their lies, they planted a gun at the scene, one that had been recovered from another location earlier. The officers knew what they had done was wrong, but in the chaos of post-Katrina New Orleans, they believed they could get away with it. They filed false reports and even pressured other officers to go along with the cover-up. For a time, it seemed like their plan might work. But as the dust settled and the city began to recover, the truth about what happened on the Danziger Bridge started to emerge. It would take years of investigation, but eventually the full extent of the officers' crimes would come to light. The investigation and legal proceedings. As the details of the Danziger Bridge incident slowly came to light, it sparked outrage across the city and the nation. The initial investigation was slow and hampered by the chaos in the aftermath of Katrina. But the families of the victims, along with civil rights organizations, refused to let the case be forgotten. The families of James Brissett and Ronald Madison were relentless in their pursuit of justice. They knew that their loved ones had been innocent, and they wanted the truth to be known. Their efforts, along with pressure from the public, eventually led to a federal investigation into the incident. The federal investigation revealed a shocking pattern of misconduct by the NOPD officers involved. Not only had they unjustly killed 2 unarmed civilians, but they had also gone to great lengths to cover up their actions. The FBI uncovered the planted gun, the false reports, and the coercion of witnesses. The case finally went to trial, and the officers were charged with a range of crimes, including civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and perjury. The trial was intense, with both sides presenting powerful arguments, but it was clear that the evidence against the officers was overwhelming. Judge Kurt Engelhardt was tasked with delivering the verdict. As he reviewed the evidence, it became clear to him that this was not just a case of a few bad apples. It was a systemic failure of the NOPD, one that went all the way to the top. In his ruling, Engelhardt didn't hold back. Judge Engelhardt condemned the actions of the officers in the strongest possible terms. He described their behavior as savage and reprehensible, and he expressed deep concern over the culture of corruption within the NOPD. But Judge Engelhardt didn't stop there. He also criticized the way the case had been handled by prosecutors, pointing out flaws in their conduct during the trial. In a move that shocked many, Judge Engelhardt granted a new trial for the officers, citing prosecutorial misconduct. This decision was controversial. but Englehart believed that justice could only be served if the trial was conducted fairly. In the end, the officers involved accepted plea deals, resulting in reduced sentences, but the damage to their reputations and their careers was irreversible. The impact of Judge Englehart's decision. Judge Englehart's decision to grant a new trial was nothing short of a legal bombshell. In a case already fraught with tension, his ruling sent shockwaves through the legal community and the city of New Orleans. Some lauded Englehart for his commitment to ensuring a fair trial, while others feared that justice for the victims might never be fully realized. Legal experts were divided. On one hand, Judge Englehart's criticism of the prosecution was seen as a necessary check on governmental power. He pointed out that the original prosecutors had failed to disclose key evidence that could have affected the outcome of the trial. This, Englehart argued, compromised the integrity of the judicial process. In his ruling, Englehart didn't mince words. He described the prosecution's actions as grotesque and repugnant, emphasizing that even those accused of heinous crimes deserve a fair trial. Englehart's stance was that without a fair process, any conviction, even of guilty parties, would be tainted, undermining public confidence in the justice system. For the families of the victims, Englehart's decision was a bitter pill to swallow. After years of fighting for justice, they were forced to relive the trauma as the case was dragged through the courts once more. However, they remained resolute, determined to see those responsible held accountable, no matter how long it took. The police reaction was equally intense. In a city already deeply scarred by the events following Hurricane Katrina, Englehart's ruling reopened old wounds. Activists and community leaders rallied, calling for reforms not just in the NOPD, but in the justice system as a whole. The case became a flashpoint in the broader national debate about police misconduct and accountability. Faced with the prospect of a new trial and the overwhelming evidence against them, the officers involved chose to accept plea deals. These deals resulted in reduced sentences, sparking outrage among those who felt that the punishment didn't fit the crime. However, for the officers, the deals represented the best chance to avoid even harsher penalties. But while their prison sentences were shorter than many had hoped, damage to their lives was profound. These once trusted officers were now branded as corrupt, their actions leading to the deaths of 2 innocent people and the injury of 4 others. Their careers in law enforcement were over, and their names would forever be associated with one of the darkest chapters in the history of the NOPD. Judge Englehart's decision also had significant implications for the NOPD itself. The case exposed not just individual wrongdoing, but systemic issues within the department. The culture of corruption and the willingness to cover up crimes rather than confront them head-on was laid bare for all to see. It became clear that the problems within the NOPD were deep-rooted and would require more than just surface-level reforms to address. Englehart's ruling acted as a catalyst for broader discussions about the need for systemic change. It wasn't just about punishing a few bad officers, it was about holding the entire system accountable. This case became a rallying cry for those demanding that law enforcement agencies across the country do more to root out corruption and restore public trust. Reforms and the legacy of the case. In the wake of the Danziger Bridge case, the New Orleans Police Department found itself under intense scrutiny. The case had exposed deep flaws in the department, leading to calls for sweeping reforms. The federal government stepped in, placing the NOPD under a consent decree, a legally binding agreement that mandated a series of reforms aimed at addressing the department's systemic issues. The consent decree was one of the most comprehensive in U.S. history, covering everything from use of force policies to officer training and accountability measures. Federal monitors were brought in to oversee the implementation of these reforms, ensuring that the NOPD made real lasting change. One of the key areas of reform was in officer training. The NOPD revamped its training programs, placing a greater emphasis on de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and ethical policing. Officers were trained to handle high-pressure situations without resorting to violence and to engage with the community in ways that built trust rather than fear. These reforms began to show results. Community leaders noted a shift in the way officers interacted with the public. There was a renewed focus on community policing, with officers encouraged to build relationships with the neighborhoods they served. The goal was to create a police force that was not just present in the community, but part of it. Another critical area of reform was in accountability. The NOPD strengthened its internal affairs division, giving it more power to investigate allegations of misconduct. Whistleblower protections were put in place to encourage officers to report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. The department also established a public database of complaints against officers, increasing transparency and allowing the community to hold the police accountable. Despite these efforts, the road to reform was not without challenges. Changing the culture of an entire police department is no easy task, and there were setbacks along the way. Some officers resisted the changes, viewing them as unnecessary or burdensome. Others struggled to adapt to the new expectations placed on them. But for many in New Orleans, the change brought about by the consent decree were a step in the right direction. The department began to see improvements in its relationship with the community, and incidents of police misconduct became less frequent. However, the legacy of the Danziger Bridge case remained a powerful reminder of what happens when a police force loses its way. The impact of the Danziger Bridge case extended far beyond New Orleans. It became a symbol in the national conversation about police reform, particularly in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and other advocacy efforts for racial justice. The case was cited as an example of why comprehensive police reform is necessary, not just in New Orleans but across the country. The case also highlighted the importance of accountability at all levels of law enforcement. It underscored the need for independent oversight of police departments, the necessity of body cameras and other technologies to ensure transparency, and the critical role that the judiciary plays in holding police accountable for misconduct. As New Orleans continues to rebuild and heal, the Danziger Bridge stands as a stark reminder of the past, a past that must never be forgotten, and a lesson that must be learned by future generations of law enforcement officers and the communities they serve. The Danziger Bridge case is more than just a story of corruption and brutality. It is a story of justice and resilience. It's a story that focuses us to confront uncomfortable truths about the institutions we trust to protect us and the consequences when those institutions fail. Judge Kurt Englehart's decision to grant a new trial was a turning point, not just in the case, but in the broader fight against police corruption. His ruling was a stark reminder that justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but about ensuring that the process is fair and just for all parties involved. For the families of James Brissett and Ronald Madison, the pain of their loss remains ever present. Yet, their unwavering pursuit of justice has left an indelible mark, not just on New Orleans but on the entire nation. Their fight is a testament to the power of resilience in the face of unimaginable grief. The Danziger Bridge case continues to resonate, reminding us that the work of justice is never finished. It calls on each of us to remain vigilant, to demand accountability, and to strive for a system that truly serves and protects all members of our society. As we look to the future, the lessons of the Danziger Bridge case serve as a guidepost. They remind us that true justice requires not just accountability for individual actions, but a commitment to systemic change. The case stands as a warning of what can happen when power is unchecked, but also as a beacon of hope that change is possible when people come together to demand it. Thank you for joining us in this journey through one of the most significant cases in recent history. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. How can we continue to fight for justice in our communities? Let's keep the conversation going.